Today we're taking you back to September 16, 1920, to the corner of Wall Street and Broad Street in New York City's financial district. This is the story of America's deadliest terrorist attack before Oklahoma City, a bombing that killed 38 people, injured hundreds more, and remains unsolved to this day. We'll explore the facts behind this forgotten tragedy that happened right in the heart of America's financial capital, just steps away from the famous J.P. Morgan Bank and the New York Stock Exchange. Wall Street gets its name from an actual wall that Dutch settlers built back in 1653. They called it Het Singel, which meant the belt in Dutch. This 12-foot-high wooden wall was meant to keep out British colonists and hostile Native Americans. The British tore down the wall in 1699, but the street kept the name. By the early 1800s, Wall Street had become America's financial center. The famous Buttonwood Agreement was signed here in 1792, creating what would become the New York Stock Exchange. Banks, trading houses, and financial companies all set up shop on these narrow, winding streets that trace the old Dutch settlement patterns. It was just past noon on Thursday, September 16, 1920. The summer heat was starting to fade, and hundreds of office workers were pouring out of the towering stone buildings for their lunch break. Wall Street was buzzing with its usual energy. Men in dark suits and women in long dresses filled the sidewalks. The smell of food from nearby restaurants mixed with the exhaust from automobiles and horse-drawn carriages that still shared the streets in those days. At exactly 12:01 p.m., everything changed in an instant. A massive explosion ripped through the intersection of Wall Street and Broad Street. The blast was so powerful that people heard it across the East River in Brooklyn. Windows shattered for blocks around. The noise echoed off the tall buildings like thunder trapped in a canyon. Black smoke billowed up between the skyscrapers. Then came the screams. When the smoke cleared, the scene looked like a war zone. 30 people lay dead on the street, killed instantly. Hundreds more were wounded, many seriously. Glass covered everything like deadly snow. Chunks of stone from damaged buildings littered the sidewalks. Blood stained the pavement red. The blast had happened right in front of the offices of J.P. Morgan & Company, one of the most powerful banks in America. The Morgan Building's thick stone walls were pocked with holes from flying metal. The U.S. Assay office next door, where they tested gold and silver, suffered the worst damage. Metal slugs had punched right through its walls in 50 different places. Within minutes, police officers and firefighters rushed to the scene. Soldiers came running from nearby Governor's Island to help. They set up a makeshift hospital right there on the street, treating the wounded on the sidewalk. Ambulances and private cars carried the injured to hospitals throughout the city. But what had caused this terrible explosion? Witnesses began telling police about a horse-drawn wagon they had seen just before the blast. Several people remembered seeing an old cart pulled by a brown horse, parked right at the corner where the explosion happened. They said the horse looked tired and the wagon seemed heavily loaded. Nobody could agree on what the driver looked like. Some said they saw a man jump down from the wagon and hurry away just before noon. Others weren't sure they had seen a driver at all. The descriptions were all different. Some said he was young, others said he was older. Some thought he had a mustache, others didn't remember one. The horse was killed instantly in the blast. So was anyone who might have been driving the wagon. That made it nearly impossible to figure out who was responsible. Investigators found pieces of the wagon scattered all over the intersection. They also discovered something else, hundreds of pieces of metal that didn't belong to any wagon. These were sash weights, the heavy iron pieces used to help windows open and close. Someone had packed the wagon full of these metal chunks along with the explosives. When the bomb went off, the sash weights flew out like bullets in every direction. The police quickly realized this was no accident. Someone had deliberately turned that wagon into a massive bomb designed to kill as many people as possible. But who would do such a thing? And why? The investigation began immediately. The New York Police Department took charge, but they got help from the Bureau of Investigation, which later became the FBI. The Secret Service joined in too. It was one of the biggest crime investigations in American history up to that point. The first big clue came from a letter carrier who found 4 crudely printed flyers in a mailbox just 1 block away from Wall Street. The flyers were printed in red ink on white paper. They carried a threatening message that read, "Remember, we will not tolerate any longer. Free the political prisoners, or it will be sure death for all of you." The flyers were signed by a group calling itself the American Anarchist Fighters. Nobody had heard of this group before, But the message was clear: they were angry about political prisoners and wanted them released. Investigators compared these flyers to ones found at other bombing sites over the past few years. They looked very similar to leaflets left at anarchist bombings in 1919. That year, a series of mail bombs had been sent to wealthy businessmen, politicians, and judges across the country. Many of these earlier attacks had been linked to followers of Luigi Galliani, an Italian anarchist who published a magazine encouraging violence against the wealthy and powerful. The timing seemed suspicious too. Just a few months earlier, two Italian immigrants named Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti had been arrested and charged with robbery and murder in Massachusetts. Many Italian anarchists believed these men were innocent and had been arrested simply because of their political beliefs. Some investigators wondered if the Wall Street bombing was revenge for these arrests. The Bureau of Investigation focused their search on Italian anarchist groups, particularly followers of Galliani. They had good reason to suspect these groups. Over the previous decade, Italian anarchists had carried out dozens of bombing attacks against banks, government buildings, and wealthy individuals. One name kept coming up in their investigation: Mario Buda. Buda was an Italian immigrant who had arrived in America in 1907. He was known to be an expert with explosives from his work in construction. He was also a close friend of Sacco and Vanzetti. Most importantly, Buda had disappeared right after his two friends were arrested. When police went looking for him, he was nowhere to be found. Investigators discovered that Buda owned a car, and this car had led police to Sacco and Vanzetti in the first place. When Buda tried to pick up his car from a garage where it was being repaired, the garage owner became suspicious and called police. But Buda escaped on foot and vanished. There was something else about Buda that caught investigators' attention. In his previous bombing attacks, he had often packed his bombs with sash weights, the same type of metal chunks found all over Wall Street after the explosion. But even with all this evidence pointing toward Buda, investigators couldn't prove he had planted the Wall Street bomb. He had left the country and couldn't be found. Without the bomber in custody, the case began to go cold. The investigation faced other problems too. The most serious mistake happened on the night of the bombing itself. City workers cleaned up Wall Street overnight so that business could resume the next morning. In their rush to get the financial district back to normal, they swept away crucial evidence that might have helped solve the crime. Pieces of the wagon, fragments of the bomb, and other clues were all carted away as debris. Today's crime scene investigators would be horrified by such careless handling of evidence. But in 1920, forensic science was still in its early days. The cleanup crew even repaired or covered up most of the damage to buildings. By Friday morning, less than 24 hours after the attack, Wall Street looked almost normal. Broken windows were covered with canvas. Workers showed up with bandages on their wounds. The New York Stock Exchange opened for business right on schedule. This quick return to normal was exactly what the bombers probably hadn't expected. If they had hoped to shut down American capitalism, they failed completely. Wall Street's message was clear: it would take more than one bomb to stop American business. But the investigation continued. Detectives interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They visited every company that made or sold sash weights, trying to trace the metal pieces used in the bomb. They checked hundreds of stables along the East Coast, looking for whoever had owned the horse. They followed up on thousands of tips from the public. Nothing worked. Every lead turned into a dead end. The case took a strange turn when investigators questioned a man named Edwin Fisher. Fisher was a lawyer and former tennis champion who had sent postcards to friends warning them to stay away from Wall Street on September 16. When police asked how he knew about the bombing in advance, Fisher said he had received the information through the air. This might have seemed like an important breakthrough, but investigators soon learned that Fisher regularly sent out warning postcards about disasters that never happened. He had mental health problems and was eventually committed to a psychiatric hospital. Doctors there said he was harmless but delusional. As months passed without arrests, public anger grew. Many Americans wanted someone punished for the Wall Street attack. This anger fueled what historians call the Red Scare, a period of intense fear and suspicion of communists, anarchists, and other political radicals. The Red Scare had actually started before the Wall Street bombing. In 1919, a wave of strikes had swept across America. Workers in steel mills, coal mines, and other industries demanded better pay and working conditions. Some Americans worried that these strikes were the beginning of a communist revolution like the one that had recently happened in Russia. The Wall Street bombing made these fears much worse. If foreign radicals could attack the heart of American capitalism, what would they do next? Newspapers called for mass arrests of suspected anarchists and communists. Politicians demanded tighter controls on immigration, especially from countries like Italy and Russia where anarchist movements were strong. J. Edgar Hoover, who was then a young Justice Department official, used the Wall Street bombing to expand his General Intelligence Division. This unit was responsible for tracking suspected radicals and would eventually become part of the FBI. The New York City Police Department also created a special unit to monitor radical elements in the city. For Italian Americans, the bombing brought increased suspicion and discrimination. Many people assumed that anyone with an Italian name must be a potential anarchist. This prejudice made life harder for millions of innocent Italian immigrants and their families. But despite all the investigating and all the fear, the bombers were never caught. The Wall Street bombing remained a mystery. In the 1950s, an elderly man living in Italy claimed to have information about the bombing. He said Mario Buda had admitted to him that he was responsible for the Wall Street attack. According to this witness, Buda had planted the bomb to get revenge for the arrest of Sacco and Vanzetti. But by then, Buda was dead, and there was no way to verify the story. The case remained officially unsolved. Today, most historians who have studied the bombing believe Mario Buda was probably responsible. The evidence pointing to him is stronger than for any other suspect. His expertise with explosives, his connection to Sacco and Vanzetti, his use of sash weights in other bombs, and his disappearance right after the attack all suggest he was the bomber. But without a confession or physical evidence linking him to the scene, we can never be completely certain. The Wall Street bombing had lasting effects on American society. It marked the beginning of the modern era of terrorism in the United States. Before 1920, most political violence in America had been connected to specific local conflicts, labor disputes, racial tensions, or regional problems. The Wall Street bombing was different. It was an attack on symbols of American power by people motivated by international political movements. The bombing also changed how law enforcement agencies worked together. The cooperation between local police, federal investigators, and the Secret Service in the Wall Street case became a model for future terrorism investigations. It helped establish the principle that attacks on American targets were threats to national security, not just local crimes. For the financial industry, the bombing demonstrated both vulnerability and resilience. The attack showed that even the most secure buildings could be targets for determined terrorists. But the quick recovery also proved that American capitalism was stronger than any single attack. The scars from the bombing remained visible on Wall Street buildings for decades. You could still see pockmarks in the stone walls of the Morgan Building and other nearby structures well into the 1960s. These scars served as a reminder of the day when terror came to America's financial capital. The Wall Street bombing held the record as America's deadliest terrorist attack for 75 years, until the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995 killed 168 people. Even after September 11, 2001, the 1920 bombing remains an important part of the history of terrorism in America. What makes the Wall Street bombing particularly significant is that it was never solved. Unlike later terrorist attacks, where authorities were able to identify and prosecute the perpetrators, the 1920 bombing remains a mystery. This failure to solve the case frustrated investigators for decades and left families of victims without closure. The bombing also raises questions about the balance between security and freedom that are still relevant today. The Red Scare that followed the attack led to violations of civil rights and persecution of innocent people based on their political beliefs or ethnic backgrounds. These same tensions arise whenever America faces terrorist threats. The story of the Wall Street bombing reminds us that terrorism is not a new phenomenon in America. Long before modern international terrorist groups, there were people willing to use violence against innocent civilians to advance their political goals. The methods change, but the basic challenge of protecting society while preserving freedom remains the same. As we walk past the corner of Wall Street and Broad Street today, it's hard to imagine the chaos and terror that erupted there on that September afternoon in 1920. The financial district has been rebuilt many times since then. New skyscrapers have replaced some of the buildings damaged in the bombing. The narrow streets are still crowded with workers, just as they were over a century ago. But the lessons from that day remain important. The Wall Street bombing showed both the vulnerability of American society to terrorist attacks and its remarkable ability to recover and move forward. It demonstrated that while violence can cause terrible damage and pain, it cannot destroy the fundamental strength of a free society. The case may never be officially solved, but its impact on American history is clear. September 16, 1920, marked the day when modern terrorism came to American shores, changing forever how we think about security, investigation, and the price of freedom in an uncertain world. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the Wall Street bombing of 1920. This forgotten piece of American history reminds us how terrorism has shaped our nation long before modern times. The victims of that September day deserve to be remembered, and their story helps us understand the challenges we still face today. If you found this documentary interesting and educational, please give it a thumbs up. Your likes help more people discover these important historical stories. And if you want to see more true crime history documentaries like this one, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into America's forgotten mysteries. What other unsolved historical cases would you like us to explore? Let us know in the comments below. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never forget that history has more secrets than we might ever imagine.